And I think that what you're doing is reminding us of the value of femininity. What is mothering? What is this role that all women, if they choose to be mothers, they are transformed into, right? There's things in your brain that wake up from this whole hormonal transformation. So I think it's really important for people to know, and I don't think that most people do know that. And on the rat studies and all of these mammal studies, the offspring aren't only emotionally resilient, but there's all sorts of immunological markers, cortisol levels of how healthy are these individuals going to be. So there is real value in what a mother does. And in order to understand this better, maybe let's look at what happens when we don't get what we need in humans. When humans are put in daycare or their mothers are absent, emotionally absent, emotionally disconnected, schizoid, sometimes as you call it, being able to really disconnect emotionally from a child who's in pain. So, what happens there to the child? And we'll get into also why mothers are often like this in terms of the postpartum depression.
Well, as I said, the first thing that happens is children get very high salivary cortisol levels. So they tested salivary cortisol in children in daycare, and they have very high stress levels in their bodies. And as I said, that's not a great thing for children. Small amounts, incremental amounts of frustration or stress are how we learn resilience, but the levels are off the charts because these children are they're separated from the person that provides them with a sense of safety in the world. And that salivary cortisol level equates later to emotional dysregulation, right? And the inability to regulate feelings of stress. So you have that. And then eventually, if it's chronic, then it becomes an attachment disorder, meaning if mothers are not physically and emotionally, I mean, let me say this, that mothers can be physically present for their children and not be emotionally present. So what I say about quality time is it's not a real thing. It's a made up thing. A lot of
Right.
this is just made up and myth. You have to be there physically as well as emotionally. You have to be there for your children. If you're not there physically, you can't be there emotionally, but you can be there physically and not there emotionally, right? So the idea is that if you're not there, children develop strategies for the most part to cope with the absence. And we call those defenses, right? But the problem is an attachment disorder is a pathological defense. It's a defense that at some point will break down because it's not really a healthy defense, right? We have healthy defenses and less healthy defenses. So children who are faced with too much either their parents' distraction or depression or absence will develop one of three attachment disorders usually. The first is an avoidant attachment disorder, and that is, you come back from quote unquote work or being away from your child, and your child looks away from you, doesn't want to engage you, but also is indiscriminately engaging other adults, nannies, or other adults. They'll go up indiscriminately to try to attach to other adults, whether it's nursery school teachers or daycare workers. And so that correlates later on with the inability to have healthy relationships and also depression. Another attachment disorder that we see is something called an ambivalent attachment disorder, where mothers will come back and those babies will cling desperately to the mothers because they know that the mothers will leave again. And they are incredibly emotionally fractious and literally cling like rhesus monkeys to their mummies, and are hysterical when their mothers try to leave again. And that correlates later to anxiety in children and adolescents and adults. But the most concerning is something called a disorganized attachment disorder, which is an attachment disorder that has no strategy. So the other two, at least there's a strategy. With an avoidant attachment disorder, the strategy is my mommy isn't there for me. I have to deal with life on my own. I'm turning away from her. The ambivalent attachment disorder is my mommy's going to leave me again. I'm going to grip on and not let go. But a disorganized attachment disorder is the absence of a strategy. And so, therefore, those babies cycle through all the strategies. They'll go from clinging to looking away to getting angry and slapping their mother to clinging to looking away. And those babies are more likely to become borderline personality disorders later on in terms of mental illness. And so, that lack of a strategy and all of those attachment disorders are passed down generationally. So if you had one of those attachment disorders, if your mother had one of those attachment disorders, it's more likely to be passed down generationally to you and then to your children, unless you break the cycle, right? So it's why I treat mothers. So to tell them that there's hope, you can break this cycle, but you have to get help. You can't do it on your own. Those
Right.
attachment disorders were not formed in isolation. They were formed as a result of a dysfunctional relationship. And then the only thing to cure them is a healthy relationship with a therapist. And that relationship is what actually heals that mother so she can interrupt the cycle of generational expression of trauma.
Right, right. And for women who are currently putting their children in daycare
Yeah.
and they're working full time and they're saying, my child is fine. They love the caregivers at the daycare, or they love their babysitter, and they don't show too much distress when I'm gone, or when I come back. What would you say to those women?
So what I would say is first you have to know what a healthy attachment looks like. So a healthy attachment looks like this. You come back from work, and that baby welcomes you with open arms and gives you lots of love and is very forgiving. And to say that if you have a single surrogate or a babysitter who is consistent, who is going to be with you for years and years, who is sensitive, empathic, and nurturing, in order of appearance, the best after a mother would be kinship bonds, someone who is related to that baby, a grandmother, an aunt, a father. That would be the first after a mother. Then would be a single surrogate, meaning a nanny or a babysitter. The next would be sharing a nanny with another mother, because that's still going to lower the ratio. The least good is daycare. So it is possible, as we say, some children, there's always the way I put it is, it sounds terrible, but there's always survivors in a shipwreck. So there's some children that will get through daycare. You don't want to bet on that, because what happens is there are certain vulnerable points in development where children will express that trauma. And often children can seemingly hold it together for short periods of time, or even long periods of time. But it's at those vulnerable points that children then will develop some of those mental health issues that I described. Meaning your child can seem fine, and then adolescence comes and they fall into a deep depression or develop severe anxiety. And you wonder why, because they seem fine the whole time. And I say, because the way that it works is trauma doesn't necessarily, sort of like mourning. I don't know if you've ever known somebody who lost a parent or lost a spouse or lost a child. They don't always cry right away. They don't
Right.
even feel the sad feelings right away. So everybody mourns at different times, and children can have mourning responses or trauma responses at a much later date than the actual occurrence of the trauma. And so, yeah, your child can seem fine, but the problem is you've made your child more vulnerable in general by making them turn on these defensive reactions. And so they are more likely to be fragile later on when they encounter what I call life's adversities, natural adversities. Adolescence is a normal, natural adversity that challenges all children's functioning, right? And if they have a difficult adolescence, if they're socially challenged, if they have weight issues, if they look a little different or sound a little different or dance to their own drummer, and they have difficulty in adolescence, if they have a learning disability, if something is more challenging for them, then we say adolescence can be a real breaking point. It's like putting too much weight on a very, very old, broken down bridge that looked fine, but really wasn't fine.
The fact that these things often take some time to show up, or they show up in ways where we might not be connecting the dots. For instance, a child who's in daycare or not in daycare, but just his mother isn't around most of the day, is showing aggressive behavior, for instance, right? He's kicking other kids and just being aggressive in the home. What's happening there? How is that connected?
So that's the fight or flight response. So if you ask any teacher in primary school to point out the kids that have been in daycare, they can tell you which children have been in daycare
Wow.
or which children have been neglected by their parents, even if their parents were home.
What are they picking up
Um,
on?
yeah, but they're picking up on fight or flight. So we have a natural evolutionary response to danger, to threat, which is that we either go into the fight mode, which is the aggressive mode. So with those children, you see more, as you say, more hitting, more kicking, more biting, more physical and emotional aggression towards other children. With the flight mode, you see more distractibility. So everyone is running around going, oh my God, 50% of children have ADHD. No, they don't. First of all, ADHD is not a D. It's not a disorder. And there's a movement to take the D off because it's not a disorder. It's a stress response. It's the flight mode of our stress system. So what it means is that we've exposed that child to too much stress in one way or another, and it's our job to figure out how we've exposed them to that stress. It could be that we forced them into a situation when they were too young to cope with that separation. It could be that they have a learning disorder that's not diagnosed, but it could be many things. It could be that there's conflict in the family, but that attentional issue is the flight mode of fight or flight. So we either see fight or we see flight as a result, often as a result of being in early daycare, but there are other reasons too. But those are stress responses, essentially.